Good morning, or now afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to check that your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. It is always appreciated. And, of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Following our initial remarks from the Congressman, our panel will be hosted by Riley Walters, who is a research assistant in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. Prior to the panel's presentation, however, we are fortunate to have Congressman Jim Bridenstine here with us today to discuss this very important issue on the aspects of Iraq and America's relationship with it and the Middle East. Congressman Bridenstine was elected in 2012 to represent Oklahoma's 1st Congressional District. He serves on the House Armed Services Committee and the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. His background includes 9 years active duty as naval aviation flying, primarily the E-2C Hawkeye. He has 1,900 flight hours and 333, I love how you got the 333s, of his carrier-arrested landings. His service includes combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, including participation in Operation Shock and Awe and Operation South Watch. While on active duty, he transitioned to the F-18 Hornet and flew at the Naval Strike Air Warfare Center, the parent command of what we know better as Top Gun. He is currently a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy Reserve. He is a graduate of Rice University and earned an MBA from Cornell. His wife, Michelle, and he both live in Tulsa, and they have 3 children, ages 8, 6, and 2. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Jim Bridenstine.
Oh, I guess I better not set that there. Well, thank you to the Heritage Foundation for having me. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to address this audience. And certainly, we in our office, we rely heavily on the research and the scholarly data that Heritage collects and reports to members of Congress so that we can make good decisions. And I very much appreciate this institution, and I very much appreciate the ability to come here and speak. So thank you for having me. What I'd like to start off with is why Iraq is important to me personally, not just as a member of Congress, but as somebody who's been involved in it from the beginning. I flew in Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. We rolled over into the Persian Gulf, and I flew Operation Iraqi Freedom. Actually, it was Operation Southern Watch, which became Operation Iraqi Freedom. And I can tell you, my experience there was that this was the most humane war ever fought on this scale in the history of the world. I can say that because the casualties were extremely low, and the amount of time it took us to get to Baghdad and ultimately take control of Baghdad was a record time. I think 3 weeks in all. And I can say that the reason we were able to do this, I was flying a platform called the E-2C Hawkeye. And the Hawkeye, we consider it the quarterback in the sky. We do command and control. So the fighter assets that are in the sky over Iraq and the troops on the ground, they need to be married up in a way where the troops on the ground, the forward line of troops, as they move forward, they're coming up against targets, personnel, armored personnel carriers, tanks. And what we do in the Hawkeye is we talk to the folks on the ground and we say, what are you up against? And they share with us what they're up against. And then we try to match the right bomb for the right target. We hit the target at the right time so that the troops on the ground can continue to march forward. What this represented, the war in Iraq, was the first time in history where we had a fully integrated air war and ground war at the same time. And this was only possible because of precision-guided munitions. And those in other words, it used to be in the 1990s when we went to war to liberate Kuwait, we did carpet bombing for months before any ground troops were even inserted. In this particular case, the air war and the ground war were conducted simultaneously because we had the ability, given precision-guided munitions, to affect targets close to the troops and yet have safe separation. And the reason that that was possible is because President Reagan and President Bush in the 80s and early 90s started making investments in these precision-guided munitions. They started investing in the Department of Defense in ways that were foretelling the future. And the reason that's important is because what's happening with the defense budget now, where we go from 5.3% of GDP under the president's budget request, he wants to take us down to 2.5% of GDP. What this does is it constrains the options for future presidents, and it puts our future warfighters at risk. What we have to do as a nation is understand that we need to balance the budget. That is absolutely true, but you don't balance the budget by cutting defense, which is what's happening right now in today's scenario. And certainly I'll talk about that a little bit later. What I'd like to say is that President Obama's decision to abandon the Iraq policy was politically motivated. Here's a quote from Senator Obama in 2006. He was talking about a premature withdrawal from Iraq, and he said it would, quote, leave behind a security vacuum filled with terrorism, chaos, ethnic cleansing, and genocide that could engulf large swaths of the Middle East and endanger America. That was Senator Obama in 2006, before he was a candidate for President of the United States. When he became a candidate for President of the United States, his tone drastically changed because it was politically expedient. And then as president, here is his quote when we were withdrawing from Iraq. Quote, these terrorists will fail to achieve their goals. The Iraqis are a proud people, and they have no interest in endless destruction. The president believed that keeping a force in Iraq was stabilizing in 2006, and he believed in 2010 that it was destabilizing. And he was correct in 2006. He is not correct in 2010 or 2011 or 2012 when he was debating the Republican nominee for president, Mitt Romney. Interestingly, it is this disengagement that has created a situation for ISIS to destabilize Iraq and establish the caliphate, as the current president, the former senator, correctly noted in 2006. I would also say that the reason we don't have a status of forces agreement in Iraq is because the president didn't want one. He had folks in Iraq saying, hey, we need 20,000 troops to secure the future. He had his national security team saying, hey, we need 20 to 24,000 troops. He said no. They came back with a proposal, said, hey, it's another proposal that said, hey, 10,000 troops is a lot more risk, but we think we can achieve our objectives, although we'll take some more losses, if we have 10,000 troops. He said no. They came back with another proposal, said 5,000 troops. He said no. Finally, he went to Maliki, and he said, we want any status of forces agreement, which is normally just an exchange of letters among diplomats. He said, instead of that, what we want is we want the Iraqi parliament to ratify the status of forces agreement. Friends, the Iraqi parliament cannot agree on what day of the week it is, let alone try to come up with a status of forces agreement for the United States and Iraq. The historical precedent of a status of forces agreement is an exchange of diplomatic letters, not the requirement to have the Iraqi parliament vote on it, which ultimately is what the president required, not because it was in the best interest of the United States of America, but because it was in the best interest of his political prospects, because he wanted the troops out. And the quote that you read, that I just read from 2010, indicates that his political prospects had changed. The big concern for me is that we don't need to make the same mistake in Afghanistan that we have already made in Iraq. And by the way, a lot of people don't realize this, but we do now have a status of forces agreement in Iraq. The president allowed 300 special operations forces to go there to provide in an advisory capacity, but he allowed it under the exchange of diplomatic letters, which he could have done in 2010 and chose not to because he wanted to get all the troops out of Iraq. Now we have that status of forces agreement. The president backtracked because it is now in his political interest to actually have a stable Iraq as people see how ISIS is destabilizing the region and destroying democratic institutions. I'm going to talk about broader national security implications. And when we talk about national security, you cannot talk about it apart from securing the homeland and securing our national sovereignty. And everybody has seen recently the crisis that is happening on the southern border. And I've been involved in this because I went to Fort Sill as part of the Armed Services Committee, and I got rejected from going to visit one of these facilities housing unaccompanied alien children. And of course, I made an issue of it in the media. Eventually, I got in. But here's what's happening there. There are people who have come to the United States illegally, hundreds of thousands of them currently residing in the United States, and they want their children and their family members and their friends to come here as well. So they're in the United States illegally, they're making money, and then they hire a coyote to bring the rest of their family members into the United States. Well, that coyote, once he gets paid, gets their family members, they come up to northern Mexico. The United States of America has not secured its southern border. So who secures it? Transnational criminal organizations in northern Mexico have taken control of the southern border. If you want to come into the United States of America, you've got to go through them. And interestingly, to go through them, it costs a lot of money, whether you're a drug trafficking organization, or you're smuggling children, or you're involved in human trafficking. This is the breakdown of civil society in northern Mexico. Now, interestingly, once the children get through that border, and here's the thing, in northern Mexico, if you don't have enough money to pay the transnational criminal organizations, the drug trafficking organizations in northern Mexico, guess what? They will get their money. And so what they do is they take the children and they extort them. They say, we're going to hold them captive until you give us more money. And in many cases, they force them to get the money. They force them into slave labor, or they force them into prostitution. And when I was at Fort Sill, and in many cases, write this down, the children disappear. And in some cases, they die. There are accounts of mass graves in northern Mexico. I used to do counter-drug operations for the United States Navy. I flew out of El Salvador, Colombia, Curacao, and I can tell you there are 70,000 to 100,000 dead bodies in northern Mexico because of a breakdown of civil society because these transnational criminal organizations have taken control. If you're a politician in these parts of northern Mexico or Central America, you're either on their payroll or you're dead. That's the reality. And there's a way we can solve this crime. And by the way, so the children that are at Fort Sill that I finally got a chance to talk to, many of them have been abused. They wouldn't give me an official number. Sexual abuse, forced into prostitution, forced into labor. They wouldn't give me a number. And finally, I grabbed one contractor and I said, based on your professional judgment, you've been doing this, based on that, how many of these children have been abused? He said it was over 25%. Interestingly, the accounts from Lackland Air Force Base down in San Antonio, it's higher. 33% of the young girls there have been abused. This is a crisis for the children, and our country ought to be doing a couple of things to prevent it from continuing. We need to secure the southern border. We need to make sure people understand that if they come, they're not going to get in, and if they do get in, they cannot stay. And the other thing we need to do is be serious about what it takes to protect the south side of the United States. And I want to be clear here. When we give this much power to transnational criminal organizations, they control governments. And when they control these governments, they align with the enemies of the United States. In fact, Russia has said, look, the United States is not doing the counter-drug operations that you need to protect your civil society. We'll come in, we'll provide those operations to make sure that the DTOs don't control your governments. And oh, by the way, all we're asking for is basing. So now we've got air bases in our hemisphere for the Russians. This is something that we haven't seen in many years, 3 decades. Rather than interdict drugs, which is what I used to do in the Navy, we used to bust $2 billion. I was with VAW 77. It's a squadron and was in New Orleans. We busted $2 billion worth of cocaine every year on the high seas. $2 billion. Interestingly, March 2013, my squadron got eliminated. That $2 billion worth of cocaine now flows into the United States and further funds transnational criminal organizations that are controlling governments south of our border. That's what's happening. And we have all but abandoned this mission in Southcom. This isn't just my take. There was a testimony from General John Kelly. He's the commander of Southcom, and he has a quote. It says the near collapse of societies, he said the near collapse of societies in this hemisphere with associated drug and illegal immigrant flow are frequently viewed to be of low importance. Many argue these threats are not existential. I disagree. General Kelly said, TCOs have a, quote, corrosive effect on the integrity of democratic institutions and the stability of several of our partner nations. This is what's happening south of the United States of America. And if we want to be able to be serious about this collapse of society south of our country and the existential threat that this represents, as they align with people that are competitive with the United States, if not enemies, and I'm talking about Russia and China, as they align with these countries, this is a threat to us. And in fact, General Kelly flat out said that because we haven't secured the southern border of the United States, just as they're smuggling children and they're trafficking humans and they're trafficking cocaine in volumes we haven't seen before in years, just as they're doing that, they could bring weapons of mass destruction and they can bring terrorists across the southern border. This is from the commander of Southcom in an article he wrote. This is I think, the takeaway here. The disengagement, whether you're talking about the disengagement in Iraq or the disengagement in Southern Command's area of responsibility, the disengagement is what puts our country at risk. None of this had to happen this way. The president has disengaged, and ultimately it puts us at risk, and it emboldens our enemies. I talked for a second about how Russia is getting basing opportunities in Central America. This is an important issue that as a nation we have to face. Russia invaded Georgia. They occupy South Ossetia and Abkhazia inside Georgia. They're moving the borders in South Ossetia towards Tbilisi. They have tens of thousands of troops in Armenia. The Baltic states enthusiastically joined NATO. They enthusiastically joined the European Union, and Russia cut off their energy in the wintertime, and people suffered. You look at Poland. Poland was building a missile defense shield. They were building it not because of Russia. They were building it because of Iran. Iran is building longer-range missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads. The United States and the European Union came together. We said, we need to build a missile defense shield to protect against this. And here's what happened. Vladimir Putin said to Poland, he said it through his generals, that if you don't bring down that missile defense shield, we're going to have nuclear war. That's when the President of the United States met with Medvedev. And he said, wait till after my next election. I'll have the flexibility to bring down that missile defense shield. And what happened? He got reelected. They brought down the missile defense shield, and Russia moved to give Edward Snowden asylum. What Russia understands is power. And when you show them weakness, they will take advantage of it. And that's what they do. You look at Ukraine. Yanukovych was trying to sign an agreement that would align them more with Europe, trade reform, social reform, political reform. This was over Thanksgiving. They were about to sign it. The day before they were going to sign it, Vladimir Putin flew to Kiev. He said, if you sign it, we're going to cut your energy off in the dead of winter. People are going to suffer and people are going to die. Oh, by the way, Vladimir Putin did this before, December 31st, 2005. Now he's doing it again. It's a very real threat. Yanukovych says, okay, well, we'll align with the customs union instead of the European Union. And he did that. The people revolted. Kiev gets set on fire. The Russians invade and occupy Crimea. And now they've destabilized eastern Ukraine with the Russian separatists. You look at the Assad regime in Syria. They're being emboldened by the Russians. You look at the mullahs in Iran. They're going around the sanctions with the help of the Russians. And the Russians, in fact, are building nuclear centrifuges in Iran. And I'll be clear, there's no reason, there's no peaceful purpose for 19,000 nuclear centrifuges. And when it comes to plutonium, there's no peaceful purpose for that at all. As far as the joint plan of action on Iran, it's a topic for another day. There's so many things going on in the world today, it's difficult to keep up. But at the end of the day, we have a challenge with Russia that is very real. And there are a number of things that we can do. Number one, yesterday, oh, by the way, they're in violation of the INF Treaty as of yesterday. The president announced that, which is, of course, a big strategic challenge for the United States of America now. Here's what we need to do. We need to lead. We have only provided sanctions to the extent that the Europeans have provided sanctions. And this is the important point. The GDP of Russia is $2 billion, and the United States economy is not very dependent on it at all. $2 billion. 2 trillion, I should say, $2 trillion is the GDP. GDP of the United States is $17 trillion. We could put sanctions on Russia across various sectors, from defense to finance to energy, in ways that the Europeans can't do. If they're not willing to do it, we should be willing to do it. And by the way, we should be exporting American energy to support our allies in Eastern and Central Europe. And I say they're not our partners, they are allies. Under NATO, they are our allies. And we can provide that energy. And by the way, if we put energy sanctions on Russia, it would dry up 50% of the Kremlin's revenue comes from the export of energy to Europe. So we could fill that gap by exporting American energy, providing the security for our friends and allies in Eastern and Central Europe, at the same time punish Russia because they won't have that revenue to further threaten their neighbors. And by the way, it'd be great for the American economy. And what's interesting is that the United States of America, it's not Vladimir Putin that's preventing us from exporting energy. It's President Obama that's preventing us from exporting energy. And that, in essence, destabilizes the world. We can fill a gap here that would be great for our economy, that would be great for the United States national security apparatus, be great for our NATO allies, and it would punish Russia for what they have done to our friends and allies. So we need to make sure that we're doing sanctions correctly. As far as our NATO allies, you know, we've sent over a few F-16s and a destroyer that intermittently cruises in the Black Sea. It's insufficient. We need to integrate with our NATO allies in NATO. We need to bolster them with our resources. I'm not saying put folks in Ukraine. What I'm saying is we need to be there for our allies in Eastern and Central Europe. We need to do exercises with them, as I did when I was in the Navy. We exercise with our allies. We need to do exercises with them, and we need to train with them. Again, here is the important challenge that we face. When you think about what's happening in Russia, again, it's the same theme, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Southern Command, or whether it's Russia. Disengagement has created opportunity for Russia to destabilize Ukraine and Eastern and Central Europe, and, oh, by the way, the South Caucasus region. We have talked a good bit about national security, and I'm going to close on a couple of things. I'll take 5 more minutes if that's okay. I have said at the beginning of this that you cannot balance the budget by cutting defense. Right now, we're cutting defense, and it's serious. It is constraining future generations, future presidents, and it's putting our future warfighters in more risk than they have to be. What I would say is that I am very serious about the debt, because it's a very real threat, as Admiral Mullen correctly pointed out a number of years ago. The debt is a threat to our country. We're in a situation now where Congress has created, for 5 years in a row, trillion-dollar deficits. This is a bipartisan problem, by the way. This is not Democrats and it's not Republicans. This is a bipartisan problem of creating trillion-dollar deficits. And we have to sell bonds to fund the government. Who's purchasing the bonds? Well, we're printing money at the Federal Reserve. We're taking the newly printed money, we're buying the newly printed bonds, and voila, we fund the government. People say, oh, that's not a problem. We don't see any inflation. Where's the inflation? Well, and this is, of course, my Democrat friends on the other side of the aisle, if you ever bought toilet paper, you'd know that there's inflation out there because the rolls are getting smaller and the ice cream containers are getting smaller and the prices are still going up. If you look at the price of food, if you look at the price of gasoline, these are not included in the CPI that the Federal Reserve uses to calculate inflation. We're seeing inflation. So that's the first point. But to the extent you're not seeing it in the volumes that you think you might otherwise see it, it's because we have a 50-year low in this country velocity of money. Banks are not lending. Why? Because of Dodd-Frank, because the bank examiners, the regulatory environment. I've got banks in my district, 6 of them that I've talked to, they don't even give home loans anymore. If there was ever a secure loan a bank should be able to give, it would be a home loan. Banks are not lending. Individuals are deleveraging. Businesses are not borrowing. Why aren't businesses borrowing? They're not borrowing because of the regulatory environment. Again, if you look at Obamacare, I've got businesses in my district. They've got 57 employees. They're trying to get down to 50, under 50, because of Obamacare. Other businesses could grow. They're choosing not to. Other businesses are selling components to make sure they don't have to go through the arduous compliance requirements of Obamacare with 50 employees. Businesses aren't lending, businesses aren't borrowing, banks aren't lending, individuals are deleveraging. We've created a 50-year low for velocity of money. That's why you're not seeing the inflation. The president says he wants to see the economy heat up. When that happens, you will see massive amounts of inflation, because right now the cash is sitting on the sidelines. When all of this newly created cash comes into the economy, you will see massive amounts of inflation, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1970s. And by the way, we saw it in the 1970s. We have recreated that situation for ourselves today. So we're going to be in a situation where we have high inflation. The only thing the Federal Reserve can do at that point to try to hold down the inflation is to start selling the bonds they've been buying. And if they sell the bonds, they get the greenbacks out of the market, that holds down inflation, but at the same time, you've got an abundance of bonds on the market now. Bond prices go down, interest rates go up, high inflation, high interest rates at the same time. Friends, we've seen this before. We've seen it in the 1970s. We have recreated it for ourselves today. If the economy were to heat up, this is exactly what you would see. It is a threat, and it's worse today than it was in the 1970s. Why? Because in the 1970s, we didn't have a $17 trillion debt. 10% of what we spend as a government is to service the federal debt. If interest rates go from 3% to 6%, it's 20% of federal spending. What are we going to cut? If it goes from 6% to 12%, now you're looking at 40% of federal spending. Now what are you going to cut? And if you go back to the 1970s, we're looking at 20% interest. My parents bought their first home at 21% interest, and at the time they thought they got a good deal. That's why people bought smaller houses back then. Friends, this is the scenario we have created for ourselves. What I would like to tell you is that this is not a creation of the Federal Reserve, although the Federal Reserve does need reforms. The dual mandate requirement, I think, is a problem. But I can also tell you that it's because Congress keeps spending money beyond which we bring in. And that, in essence, is what kills the budget of the United States and has ultimately led people to cut defense the way it's being cut. And it needs to stop. We have to reform entitlements if defense is going to be strong enough to secure our country for the future. That's the requirement. You cannot balance the budget. You could eliminate the entire defense budget altogether, and we're still running a deficit. The key, if you look 15, 20 years down the road, the key is entitlement reform. And Republicans and Democrats alike need to come together and figure out how to solve that crisis before we completely annihilate the defense of the United States and the future of our children. What I would also like to say is that this crisis can be solved very easily. If we were on a path to a balanced budget, we wouldn't have the scenario that I just described. We wouldn't be there right now. We have created a threat for our country that isn't necessary. And by the way, if we did get to a balanced budget, what you would see is the dollar strengthen in massive ways as people would be investing in the United States of America the way they're not investing right now. I'm going to close on two quotes. This is a quote from Dr. Joseph Warren. He was in the Massachusetts Congress at the founding of our country. He said this: "Our country is in danger, but not to be despaired of. On you depend the fortunes of America. You are to decide the important questions upon which rests the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourselves." Friends, I'm here to tell you that America is ready for its members of Congress to start acting worthy of itself, of ourselves. The challenge before us is immense. It can be dealt with, but it's going to require courage. It's going to require people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do and that are politically unpopular, because we need to save this country, which is far more important than political popularity. One other quote I have, a gentleman named Martin Treptow. He fought in World War I. He was a barber, and he got drafted. And they sent him over to Europe. And he got killed. And they found this in his journal, a quote. His quote is, "America must win this war. Therefore, I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure. I will fight cheerfully and do my utmost, as if the issue of the whole struggle depended on me alone." Friends, there's a lot of us in this room who have fought for our country. And I can tell you, all of us feel that way about our country when we go to war. And I can also tell you that the courage and moral will of free people is much stronger than any of the threats of these terrorists that we face. What it's going to require is political leadership and the courage and moral will of free people and the folks who serve us in the United States Armed Services. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here.
Thank you. A couple of questions.
Sure.
We do have time for a couple of questions. If you would like to be recognized, please raise your hand. Our only request is that you wait for the microphone. And if you'd be so kind as to identify yourself and maybe an affiliation just as a courtesy to the congressman. Do we have a question? Come on, we've got to have a question. Nobody's concerned about Iraq? What do you think are our chances in the House of addressing the threat you were just mentioning about the balanced budget? Are we almost at a stalemate that's not going to change anytime soon?
Well, you know, I think here's what's interesting about the budget. You know, the House passed the Ryan budget because we created the no budget, no pay provision. The Senate actually passed a budget for the first time in 4 years last year, but the budgets didn't match each other. So ultimately, you're at an impasse for the budget. So we came to an agreement on the Ryan Murray budget. And of course, I didn't vote for it because I didn't think it was supportive of the folks who fight our country's battles. But at the end of the day, there was an agreement, a budget agreement. Everybody said if we're going to pass appropriation bills to fund this government in regular order, we got to have a budget. We got to have the top line numbers to have a budget. Once again, the House of Representatives, we've been passing appropriation bills. We've passed 7 of them. Department of Defense appropriations. We're going to do Homeland Security, energy and water, financial services, military construction, veteran affairs. These appropriation bills in the House of Representatives, we are passing. We've done 7 of them. There's a total of 12. Interestingly, the Senate has done nothing. Again, last year, in 2013, in July of 2013, again, we were passing appropriation bills to fund the government in regular order, which is how my constituents get representation, because I get to, in an appropriation bill, I get to go to the floor, and I get to make the case for what we need to spend and what we need to cut. So, look, the world is different today than it was last year. But if you don't do appropriation bills, you can't affect that. And by the way, we've been doing appropriations under this president under continuing resolutions for 5 years in a row. That means the people back at home are not being represented. The world has changed. Members of Congress don't have an opportunity to impact federal spending, and this creates a crisis. Now, interestingly, we've passed appropriation bills in the House. We did it last year. Ultimately, Harry Reid passed none of them, not a single appropriation bill. The government shuts down, and somehow they blame Republicans. I'm still trying to figure that out. If you don't do a CR, then guess what? You know, Harry Reid would say that you're an anarchist. The president's folks would call you a terrorist. You're negotiating with bombs strapped to your chest. Nancy Pelosi calls you an arsonist because she doesn't know the difference between an anarchist and an arsonist. But this is the environment in which we reside, and we are doing the people's business in regular order, funding the government, and Harry Reid is doing nothing, so we're heading towards another shutdown unless we do a CR, and if we don't do a CR, it's going to be the Republican shutdown, even though we have passed appropriation bills under the agreed-upon Ryan Murray budget deal. I'll tell you, this place is frustrating. So the question is this: will Harry Reid honor his obligations under the Ryan Murray budget deal? And what I'm seeing is no. I will also say that in the House of Representatives, we have passed 352 bills that are sitting in the Senate that Harry Reid won't take up. 352. What do you hear in the media? You hear about the do-nothing Congress. Well, I'm here to tell you it's a do-nothing Senate because I'm working very hard over there trying to understand all these bills that we're passing. But unfortunately, as long as Harry Reid controls the Senate, I do think we're going to have an impasse. It's why it's so critically important that we win the Senate here in November, and I think we're going to.
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
joining us.
Appreciate
And I'll
it.
invite Riley and the rest of the panel up.
Thank you so
See you.
much.
Yes. I'd like to thank the representative for his great remarks. Thank you. I'm Riley Walters. I'm a research assistant here at the Heritage Foundation. Though I like to think I share his devilishly good looks, I am not Peter Brooks. Sorry for the misunderstanding. First to my left, we have a great panel. First, we have Jessica Lewis. Jessica Lewis is a research director at the Institute for the Study of War. She joined ISW in 2012 following 8 years on active duty as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army. Her military career includes 34 months deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, where she provided intelligence support to tactical, operational, and theater commands. She has twice been awarded the Bronze Star Medal for her impact upon operations. Jessica is the lead analyst for the ISW's portfolio on the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and is the author of many studies, including al-Qaeda in Iraq is Resurgent and the Islamic State of Iraq Returns to Diyala. Jessica is the lead architect for ISW's technology and data strategy. She is charting a course to advance ISW's signature analytic methodologies and to revolutionize the conduct of intelligence for open sources. In particular, she works to incorporate the function of early warning into ISW's regional work. Jessica has made frequent appearances on both television and radio programs, including Fox News, CNN, Al Jazeera America, BBC, Voice of America, NPR, and Wall Street Journal Live. In addition, she has been cited in numerous articles in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and other publications. To her left, we have Dr. Stephen Bucci, Director of Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy Studies. He is also Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation for all issues involving Homeland Security and Defense. Dr. Bucci serves as a subject matter expert for cybersecurity, special operations, and defense support to civil authorities. Bucci brings 30 years of leadership at the highest levels of government in response to all security threats to America. Dr. Bucci assumed the duties of the military assistant in the Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, July 1st, 2011, saw the 9/11 attacks, the war on terrorism, and led a team of 25 U.S. military experts to Baghdad to directly assist the Coalition Provisional Authority. He daily reviewed all intelligence for the Secretary. He was next appointed to serve as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Homeland Defense and Defense Support to Civil Authorities, and Dr. Bucci worked for 3 years for the IBM Corporation. He is an adjunct professor at George Mason University in Leadership and an associate professor at Long Island University in Terrorism Studies and Cybersecurity Policy. And last but not least, we have Jim Phillips, Senior Research Fellow for the Middle Eastern Affairs in the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies here at the Heritage Foundation. He's a veteran foreign policy specialist who has written widely on Middle Eastern affairs and international terrorism since 1978. Since 9/11, he has written extensively on the global war against terrorism and its implications for U.S. policy in the Middle East. He's also testified before Congress on Middle East security issues, including al-Qaeda, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Middle Eastern terrorism. He is a former research fellow at the Congressional Research Library for the Service for the Library of Congress, and a former joint doctoral research fellow at the East-West Center. I believe we'll start with Jessica and work our way over. Does that work?
Okay.
Or do you want to go first?
I could go first.
Okay.
Just to introduce I think my colleagues are going to look at the implosion in Iraq in terms of military and security, but I'd like to examine the rise of the Islamic State in a regional context and also in terms of revolutionary politics, because it's much more than just a terrorist group. It sees itself as a vanguard of a global insurgency. It tries to link Iraqi and Syrian local grievances to a more regional insurgency, and ultimately could emerge as a global threat. Formerly known as ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, it's a direct descendant of al-Qaeda in Iraq. It's an even more malignant, cancerous outgrowth of the al-Qaeda core group, and it's metastasizing rapidly by feasting on the corpses of the failed states in Iraq and Syria. It poses an increasingly dangerous threat to the U.S. and its allies, now a regional threat, but could become global if it's able to consolidate power and territory, and especially a lot of the resources that are in Iraq and Syria that al-Qaeda did not find in Afghanistan. And although it's drifted from al-Qaeda core group, it shares its strategy. It's more of tactical differences that differentiate, and perhaps personal ambitions. So potentially, I think it could become even more of a global threat than the al-Qaeda core group that is, lurking in the Badlands of Pakistan. This is in the heart of the Arab world, and since al-Qaeda is primarily an Arab organization, it makes it easier to attract and recruit young Arabs to its cause. It's also closer to Europe and the West for attracting Western militants that it can recruit. It's extremely resilient. It survived an intensive counterterrorism campaign led by the U.S. It's very opportunistic. When it was decimated inside Iraq, it moved across the border into Syria. Many of its members belonged to tribes that straddled the border. And it flourished in an increasingly sectarian civil war in Syria. It's evolving very rapidly from an Islamist revolutionary terrorist group, and it's now acquiring some of the organs of a state or a quasi-state, including army, a court system, media outreach, mobilization. Its goals include overthrowing the governments not just of Iraq and Syria, but also, in terms of greater Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and ultimately working for the destruction of Israel. In the long run, it seeks to launch a jihad to drive Western influence from the Middle East and become the nucleus of a global Islamic empire. It now has proclaimed a caliphate. That means that it sees itself not just as an Islamic State, it sees itself as the Islamic State, a successor not just to bin Laden, but to the Prophet Muhammad. This specious claim has triggered a backlash among Sunni religious scholars, many other Islamist leaders who reject this kind of assertion, and it's even drawn criticism from the al-Qaeda core group from which it's drifted away. But the claim of religious legitimacy, as flawed as it is, could help it in attracting and recruiting followers among impressionable young Muslims. The Islamic State's leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, claims more religious credentials than previous al-Qaeda leaders, including descent from the Prophet, and apparently, or at least reportedly, he claims to have been a PhD candidate in Islamic studies at a Iraqi university. He's charismatic and mysterious, and he's has a strong appeal for many youthful followers. He's extremely ambitious. He broke with al-Qaeda core in April 2014 and denounced it for what he considered to be a deviant path. He fashions himself, as I said, not just as a successor to bin Laden, but to the Prophet Muhammad. And ultimately that could have a lot of resonance in the Middle East and the broader Muslim world. His movement is composed of Sunni Muslims drawn to radical Islamist ideology. Most of them are Iraqi and Syrians, although it's attracted a wide spectrum of other Arabs, particularly from Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Libya, Yemen, and Egypt. That movement was founded by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in 2004 in Iraq. He was a Palestinian born in Jordan, petty criminal who was converted to radical Islam in prison, and that's a common vector for the spread of this Islamist violence, a virus, not only in the Middle East, but also within the U.S. From the beginning, his organization was exceedingly brutal, even by al-Qaeda standards. Zarqawi personally beheaded an American hostage, Nicholas Berg, in 2004, and saw fit to videotape the process and distributed that video widely. There were always ideological tensions between al-Qaeda in Iraq and the parent group. It was always more anti-Shia than the al-Qaeda core, perhaps because bin Laden had some of his family members that were kept under house arrest in Iran, and he didn't want to rattle Tehran's cage too much. But Zarqawi did not hesitate at attacking Iranian pilgrims in Iraq, and especially the Iraqi Shia majority. Zarqawi was one of the estimated 25,000 Muslims that flocked to the jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan. Initially, he was not part of the al-Qaeda network. He led his own group, Organization of Monotheism and Jihad, and ran his own training camp in western Afghanistan. From there, he went to Iraq. He pledged allegiance to bin Laden and was anointed as the commander of al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2004. His organization is responsible for the death of hundreds of U.S. troops. They spearheaded the uprising at Fallujah, which historically has been a hotbed of Islamist sentiments in Anbar province in western Iraq. And in January, this organization returned to Fallujah. And I remember at that point, 6 months ago, the three of us were on a panel along with General Conway, former commandant of the Marine Corps who led some of the Marine forces at Fallujah. Talking about much the same things, and I'm glad to see that we have a lot more turnout today. I mean, I think, unfortunately, many people in Washington were asleep about the resurgence of al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was severely degraded in an intensive counterterrorism campaign led by the U.S. coalition forces and the Iraqi government before U.S. troops withdrew in 2011, but it's extremely resilient. It survived the death of Zarqawi in a U.S. airstrike in 2006. It made a comeback by exploiting the mistakes of the Iraqi government, by taking advantage of the negligence of the U.S. government, and by tapping into the fears of Iraq's Sunni Arab minority that was marginalized and increasingly excluded from power by a sectarian government led by Prime Minister Maliki in Baghdad. It was not inevitable that al-Qaeda would make a comeback, but it was predictable, and we at Heritage did warn about the dangers of not leaving behind a residual U.S. presence to help the Iraqis train, to give them greater intelligence and greater counterterrorism capabilities against al-Qaeda in Iraq. So unfortunately, that organization was allowed to resurge in a much more benign, more permissive environment. And it's important to note that the current upsurge of the Sunni insurgency is a lot more than just al-Qaeda in Iraq. It does not lead a monolithic insurgency. It's merely a small part of, although it gets all the headlines, it's only a small part of that insurgency. There are other tribal and national groups, nationalist groups battling the Shia-dominated government. And this is not just a bipolar conflict between the Islamic State and Baghdad. It's a complex, multipolar struggle in which there are many other groups, a kaleidoscopic struggle that includes not only other rival Islamist extremist groups among the Sunnis, but many Shia as well. It involves Sunni political leaders who feel disenfranchised by the Shia-dominated government, Baathists who are trying to make a comeback, and I think, importantly, tribal leaders who see it as a lesser evil compared to the treatment they got from the Maliki government. All of these groups seek to advance their own interests, and to defeat the Islamic State, I think we need to peel it away from these ad hoc allies and exploit its Achilles heel. That's the fact that its harsh ideology alienates people wherever it comes to rule over them. It's sowing the seeds of its own destruction. You may have seen pictures recently about decapitated bodies in its capital in Raqqa, Syria, and heads on pikes. And this, by violently imposing this repressive rule, I think it's creating the circumstances which could be used by a wide coalition of forces against it. I think the bottom line is that the Islamic State is a potent and resilient evolving threat. The latest evolution of is what I call Islamist totalitarianism that seeks to go back to the past, an imaginary utopian past, which would be a dystopia for us and for all Muslims that are forced to live under it. To defeat it, the U.S. must work with a wide coalition, not only the Iraqi government, but subnational actors, such as the Kurds, tribal leaders, and particularly Iraqi Sunni Muslims that soon will be fed up with living under it. Also work with Iraq's neighbors, particularly Turkey and Jordan, and moderate elements within the Syrian rebellion that already are fighting the ISIS elements in Syria. This is a regional problem, and it needs a regional solution before it evolves into a global threat. Let me just stop there.
Jessica, would you?
Well, excellent. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for that beautiful framing. I'll jump in perhaps from the tactical perspective and broaden us back up to meet that framing. 6 months ago, we were describing what had happened with ISIS in terms of a military growth step from an organization that was able in the previous annual campaign to mature a signature capability to set off many waves of car bombs. And ISIS was able to maximize the use of these waves, really demonstrating very early on that their military institutions were reconstituted by, at the end of their first year campaign, breaking a whole bunch of people out of prison. So one of the first things that I want to express is that this organization has been demonstrating its tactical capability to be as dangerous as ever AQI was, now for 2 years. After the Abu Ghraib prison, the geography of this group really started to shift to one that is perhaps the most dangerous element of my brief this morning, that AQI most likely reconstituted very close to Mosul in northern Iraq and was able to project their capability back down. But that after the Abu Ghraib prison break, which was last year at this time, ISIS at that point was able to reestablish strongholds in and around Fallujah and in and around the Baghdad belts, which is a region just like a circle outside of Baghdad that provides almost limitless interior support zones in and around Baghdad city. So at that point in time last year, we had Baghdad already as an attack zone with these car bomb waves at a maximum level targeting Shia civilians. We had many potential gunmen coming out of prisons and going to ISIS inside the Baghdad belts. And then we saw ISIS start to do things that were much more at the operational level of war. And over the course of the last year, we have seen ISIS perfect the ability to execute a complex attack upon a fixed site, to prepare conditions in an urban center such that one can roll in with a convoy of gunmen and take it over, and in fact demonstrate that capacity 2 months ago in the second largest city in Iraq. Now, one of the questions that I frequently get is, how was ISIS able to make that last rate step change happen? How is it that ISIS was able to go from car bomb waves and prison breaks to taking over Mosul with so little resistance? And part of the answer is that ISIS has been developing new capacities over on the Syrian side that I'll reference just so that we understand how we should frame what is going on in Iraq in a military discussion. ISIS, in January of this year, established full control of a city that had been occupied by Syrian opposition forces and also by Jabhat al-Nusra, the other al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, until the point that these forces became military enemies among themselves. The Syrian opposition Jabhat al-Nusra the same month pushed ISIS out of many places in northern Syria, out of Aleppo city, out of Idlib. ISIS consolidated their strength in Raqqa, started developing these state-building and governance capacities, and demonstrated the ability to defend that with the military. So we see probably most significantly out of everything else that I've seen ISIS demonstrate over the last month, the ability to transition consolidated military control to political control, lending us to another major observation. They have this operational capacity to execute military campaigns that are simultaneously executed across fronts in Syria, fronts in northern Iraq, fronts in western Iraq, while they're maintaining terrorist attacks in and around Baghdad. And then once they translate those gains into control of urban centers and major cities in Iraq and Syria, they are then able to follow that up with social control measures, many of which are coercive, or intentional displacement of people, which lessens the requirement to influence them, and then to start trying to build institutions that make this caliphate a reality. Now, there are a couple of considerations as we evaluate what else besides the military they are able to bring to the table. Is ISIS actually able to make Mosul run? Is actually a very good question we can explore. Sadly, if they are not able to run, there's some pretty serious consequences for Iraq. So as we look at what else besides a military campaign ISIS is able to do, we also have to understand that if they are not successful, right now Iraq is actually facing a great peril of major cities that are under ISIS control and not under government control, falling into permanent disrepair. So I do agree very much that a strategy to defeat ISIS has to deal with a couple realities. This is now no longer a terrorist organization. The military, tactical, and operational and strategic levels I just laid out are characteristic of how I would describe an army. I do agree very much with the assessment that that's what we're dealing with, but that this is not only an army, as perhaps it might have been 6 months ago, that has fixed positions and repeatable processes and institutions that are outside of cities where they might have been more vulnerable to airstrikes, for an example. We're now dealing with that enemy that is occupying Iraq's biggest cities. If we're not going to have a conversation about how to get ISIS out of Mosul and out of Raqqa, then the conversation, in my view, about ISIS defeat is actually scaled down too low. Now, there is also a very specific window of time where ISIS is building this transition in Iraq to match what it has done in parts of Syria, where ISIS can still be, its military plan for Iraq can still be disrupted, and they can still lose the initiative that they've maintained for 2 years, such that I do not believe that the threat of ISIS has come to its full maturity. However, I do want to frame that in the sense that what has just happened with the fall of Mosul is perhaps the most dangerous element of everything that ISIS has presented as a threat over the course of the last 2 years, and what they have done to follow on with that threat to make sure that the caliphate that they have declared is territorially contiguous is a follow-on operation. I take Mosul very seriously as a major turning point in the regional implications of ISIS, not just as a post-state vision in progress, but in fact as a potential permanent threat to the states of Iraq and Syria.
Hey, I'm going to exercise the fact that the moderator works for me, and so does one of the people on the panel, that we're going to go a little longer because I want to be able to get some questions from all of you. Just real quickly, you know, I'm the sort of talented amateur in all this compared to the two experts on either side of me. But I look at the wider implications for what this is. And there's a lot of folks here in Washington who immediately, when this stuff started to happen, said, well, okay, so let's chalk it up. We blew it in Iraq. You know, we don't care. Let's just let them fight it out. What difference does it make? I got to tell you, that's a really, really short-sighted view of what can happen. There are wider security implications of the founding of the caliphate of the Islamic State. And it goes beyond, you know, the obvious ones. We've got some really good allies in the area, like Jordan, like Turkey, like Israel, that are going to be horrendously threatened if we allow this, the caliphate to stand as it looks like it is right now. But beyond that, you know, even if you want to be the kind of people who discount those things too and say we shouldn't be worried about that, what are the implications for us here in the United States? Well, I have to tell you, you know, the Syrian civil war turned into a giant petri dish of Islamic radicalism, and part of the outgrowth of that was the survival of the Islamic State in Iraq and its conversion to ISIS, and now to the Islamic State as a caliphate. They went there, they got more recruits, they got more training, they got more equipment, and they turned it around and came back into Iraq and did the operation that Jessica described. And now the experts, and I just spent last week out at the Aspen Security Forum, which had like every former and present member of the intel community and government that deals with this stuff. And the discussion that hit me the most was how many of these folks working for ISIS and now the Islamic State are Western passport holders. And the consensus among the intel geeks that were out there was that it was at least in 3 digits, or excuse me, 4 digits. And then I said, okay, I queried a few. I said, that's kind of a big spread, guys. Narrow it down a little bit. And the consensus was between 2,000 and 3,000 of the hardcore fighters that have been fighting in Syria in the Civil War and are now fighting in Iraq as well have Western passports. Some of them don't look like what people who man our airports think Muslim fighters might look like. Some of them have blonde hair and come from places like Norway and France. And some of them are Americans. And I have to tell you, as a former SF guy who, you know, like chases people like that around for a living, if there were 300 of them, that would be a huge, huge threat to this country. This country here, not just our interests abroad, but us here in the United States. That is what we're facing right now. Western Europe is going through the same sort of thing. We've got a lot of cooperation going on with our intel communities to try and deal with this. But, you know, we're looking at pre-9/11 Afghanistan with a lot better airports and a lot closer locations to the people and things we care about than Afghanistan ever was. So this is a threat to, frankly, the vital national interests of the United States and to the United States home security. I was going to emphasize, but Jessica covered it real well, this conversion of ISIS from a terrorist group, because we still, when you read in the newspapers, that's what everybody refers to them as, the terrorist group. Well, they're a little past that, right? They're doing stuff, they're still using terrorism, don't get me wrong there. That is a tactic they use, you know, quite brutally. But they're beyond that. Now, on the good side, when you start to do that, when you move to mobile warfare and start running around and taking cities, you're open to other sorts of attack. So there are some options there as to what either we or some of our allies could do to combat them. You know, if they start riding in armored trucks and tanks that they now have towards Baghdad, you can go out and kill those things. It's easier to find a tank than it is to find a bunch of guys walking around on the ground or driving in an old Toyota. So that's on the good side. But we do have a lot of allies that have a lot at stake that are starting to wake up. Turkey, who was helping certain elements of the Syrian resistance and are now, you know, realizing kind of missed it on that one. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, these countries who frankly have supported some of the radical elements in the Syrian resistance are now going, ooh, maybe not such a good deal. Now, a lot of them were very motivated by trying to counter Iran and their influence, but they're realizing that, you know, when you let go with the sword, it can cut both the person using it and the person that was identified. I'll leave other stuff to my much more qualified expert friends on either side of me about some of the nuances, but you know, there's a lot of governments, some kings, some other types of governments who are not real thrilled that Mr. al-Baghdadi has put out the call that everybody's supposed to flock to him and follow his lead. One hopes that some of those countries, even if they agree with him religiously, and most of them don't, but some of them might, that they take enough umbrage to the fact that he's now demanding their fealty to him to maybe push back and push back in the physical sense, not just in the ideological sense as well. And with that, I will stop and turn it back over to Riley.
Great. We'll take time for some Q&A. Please wait for the mic to come to you, state your name, affiliation, and of course, pose your question in the form of a question. Thank you. Do we have any questions? Yes, right here.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rabinowitz, and I'm retired, happily. There's an old saying that to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And to a military person, everything looks like a military situation. I was wondering if you know of any non-military approaches people might be using, might be applicable to the situations you've described.
I have the most time in the military, so I'll go first. No, let you go. Yeah, I think that I don't think there's very many people, including I don't think anybody on this panel that's advocating we launched our Army and Marine Corps back into Iraq to fight this. There are some military elements that could and probably should by the Iraqi government in particular to be launched on them. But yeah, the core of this is political, frankly, and religious. I mean, al-Maliki, in my opinion, kind of screwed it up badly when he had a lot of the Sunni tribal leaders in the areas that are now controlled by the Islamic State that were on the Baghdad government's side. That was how we crushed al-Qaeda in Iraq down to the size that it was. It was almost a non-entity. It was essentially defeated. We didn't kill it, unfortunately, and it managed to resurrect itself at the same time that those same Sunni tribes broke with Baghdad because al-Maliki was treating them so badly. So frankly, there's a heck of a lot of political stuff that could be done to win those folks back, which would be a big pushback on the Islamic State. So you're absolutely right. It's not a purely military solution. Anybody, regardless of their background, who thinks that, I think, is sadly mistaken. There's a lot of other elements we need to get involved in it.
Well, I very much agree. ISIS is basing its grand strategy upon hard power, so someone is going to have to. But I think it's a very different thing for the United States to contribute insight about what the counter strategy to defeat ISIS militarily needs to be and who needs to do what in order to bring that about. I think that a conversation about specific means like airstrikes is actually premature before such a strategy is really well understood. But I also think that the window of time is closing when Iraq is going to be able to do anything about the ISIS problem, and that their potential to do something about it is contingent upon Iraq's ability to create a unified security plan that can go on the offensive inside the Sunni heartland, which absolutely depends upon exactly that demographic, which has departed the folds of the government of Iraq purposefully and quite a long time ago when the Sunni population started expressing their unrest through a long-standing protest movement. And that same strategy also needs, in my view, to remain unified with the Kurdish strategy, because the terrain of Iraq actually lends incredible advantage to a force that can cause the government and its augmentation. The civilians who've mobilized with the government, the civilians within the occupied territories of Iraq, and the Kurdish population, all to do the same thing in a synergistic way to counter ISIS militarily. An internal or an external security plan to counter ISIS devoid of any one of those elements does not strike me as having an opportunity for success. So bringing those conditions into alignment is, in my view, actually a political requirement also.
Yeah, I think just very quickly, I think the political piece is a huge part of solving this problem. And, nature may abhor a vacuum, but al-Qaeda loves them. And in order to defeat this al-Qaeda offshoot, we've going to drain away Sunni Arab support for it. The best way to do that is by through outreach of an inclusive, decentralized Baghdad government, which needs to not include Prime Minister Maliki, who has antagonized not only the Sunni Arabs but the Kurds, and the Kurds need to be a big military part of whatever counter offensive comes, and so I think it's important to press Baghdad to reform itself, which is a big task, and give Sunnis who see ISIS as the lesser evil, give them something else that they can build for. Not just, if we treat this as a hammer, a purely military operation, it's doomed to fail.
Can I just throw one last thing, though, on that? Everybody always says that, and it's absolutely true. That, the military is not the solution for everything. But when you're fighting people like hardcore Islamists, like the Islamic State is made up of, you're just as wrong if you leave the military component out of it. Because some of those people, they don't want to talk to anybody. They don't want to have any negotiations. It doesn't matter what the heck we do to attract them. That's not their thing. And some of those people you just have to fight. So you really need a balance. The political part and religious part should lead, but unfortunately, you do need some component of the military. You hope you can minimize it, but leaving it out completely is a fool's errand. You're hoping against hope with a lot of these folks.
First in the back, and then.
Thank you. I'm Dino Drudy, an interested citizen. Of course, nearby all of this, on which the panel touched only in passing, is Iran. And Iran is Shiite, and is probably the world's premier Shiite power. And there are large numbers of Shiites in Iraq and in the smaller Persian Gulf states, even the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. We have crossed swords with Iran over its alleged nuclear program. How effective would Iran be as a natural counterbalance to this Islamic State?
Well, let me just take, I think there's a lot of speculation about Iran as a potential ally versus ISIS. People, it seems like the only Arab proverb people know is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but sometimes the enemy of your enemy is your enemy. Sometimes, and we need to keep that in mind. One of the problems with Iraq today is that Iran has leaned on the Shia government to make it even more sectarian, less open to Sunnis, because it fears a return of Ba'athis or some kind of Sunni-Saudi alliance. I think Iran is part of a problem in Iraq. I don't see it as a healthy part of the solution, because already there are Revolutionary Guards fighting inside Iraq, and to the degree that Iran gets more involved on the ground, that'll accentuate the sectarian character of the struggle and make it easier for ISIS to continue to say it's defending all Sunni Arabs against the Shia menace. So I'd be very, very careful about any kind of close cooperation with Iran.
Well, I'd love to add on that too, and just say, in terms of the political requirement we outlined a moment ago, Iran is the biggest vulnerability to a unified Iraq security solution to ISIS, in my view. Now, they have a legitimate reason to be concerned about their own border security, because ISIS and other anti-government groups are reaching all the way out to the eastern Diyala province and right up next to the border crossing with Iran. So I also think it reasonable that Iran be very concerned about its equities and its interests in Iraq, not only in terms of an allied state, while Assad, another ally, is actually in a worse position now than he was a month ago, in my view, in Syria. But also because of the Sunni shrines. So these are all reasons why, of course, Iran is going to be concerned, and of course, Iran is going to be involved. The consequence, though, is, and I would agree, that the Sunni population particularly, but also the Kurds, have to try to figure out what their play is when the government of Iraq is being coached by Iran and is integrated with Shia militias. One of the requirements I would further express for the U.S. is that our position and our value as a potential ally used to be expressed by Iraqis as neutrality along ethno-sectarian lines. And to do something in support of the Iraqi government right now is to do it with Iran, unless we can figure out a way to be supportive and still also neutral, that this is actually one of the biggest challenges before us. How not to change everything else that we have expressed the need to do vis-a-vis Iran, help Iraq remain intact without being an ally with Iran in a way that would cause us to look like our policies for Iraq and Syria are different, which would kind of be bad for us globally.
And then the last thing is, keep in mind, Mr. Rouhani is not a moderate. He is not someone whose basic interests are to help America out and help us fix our problems. He'll help us fix our problems, but he's got the next 3 or 4 steps planned out that are all going to be in the interest of Iran, not us. And I'd love to say that our politicians are, you know, like Metternich and all these guys moving all the pieces on the chessboard. We're just not very good at that. And Rouhani is thinking that way. So, you know, again, we might have to do something with them on a very tactical level, but I'm very, very reluctant to walk up, throw our arms around the Iranians and say, let's go solve this problem together, guys, because we'll lose that really quickly.
Last question
here. Thank you for your panel. My name is Hermes Leary from OWS. I would just like to see if you're suggesting that the ISIS have a long-term premeditated plan that they just applied now. And if this is the case, if this doesn't suggest an overall, maybe worldwide plan for the Muslims community.
Well, I'd be happy to start, but I think we're all trying to catch up with just how much ISIS has been publishing on this subject over the last 2 months, and very graciously in Western languages and primarily in English. One of the most incredible pieces to lay out their strategy retrospectively that I've ever seen was a magazine they just put out last month called The Beak. Sadly, they just published the 2nd issue of it. But the whole purpose of this magazine is to say, this was our plan, this is how it is the right way, this is how every other way is not the right way, for all of those visions that are ideologically aligned with the kind of caliphate that we've just declared that we have built. And we're saying it in English because we want all of you Westerners who are out there who haven't come yet, whether you be fighters or potential citizens, you should come. Come live in this thing that we're building. Now, to your very specific question as to whether that argumentation is actually retrospective or whether its revelation and publication is retrospective, I would actually say I think that ISIS is filling in some blanks to make sure that they are not just a military power with some state-building capacities that has established a new regime stronghold in a secular sense, that they actually need to make sure that they express to the rest of the global jihadist community that this is actually the legitimate caliphate. And they've been very careful with their references to authoritative hadiths to make sure that it's an impervious argument. So they clearly really care about this. I do think that they're going to try to make a play for leadership of the global jihadist movement. As of right now, only one of the major al-Qaeda affiliates has actually reached up to acknowledge that ISIS has done this at all, which is interesting as a very controlled behavior. But my bigger concern actually is what happens if ISIS is able to keep claiming that establishing military control is the most efficient way to break down modern states and bring about our shared vision, and people who otherwise were trying to do global insurgency in a low-profile way, the Zawahiri, al-Qaeda way, start finding this method to be more compelling. So to your question, I think they're filling in some gaps, but they have also been working on the military side of this to erode the security situation in Iraq and to take advantage of the situation in Syria for 2 years.
Yeah, I would just say I think they see themselves as a vanguard to bring heaven to earth. And all religious movements, well, most that I've studied that promise heaven on earth actually deliver hell on earth. And it's certainly hell on earth for Christians in Iraq today. But even for Muslims, it's going to be increasingly hell on earth, because this is a takfiri organization that declares Muslims that oppose its ideological program are no longer Muslims, and therefore their lives are at risk. And that kind of absolutist behavior is going to increasingly alienate even some of their initial supporters. And this is part of the Achilles heel that I was trying to talk about, it being the weakness of their ideology. And as long as they're posing as the champions of Sunni, especially Sunni Arabs against a non-Sunni Arab force, then they have very high prestige and support. But when that conflict against the other dies down and they're left with a repressive dictatorship over many very religious, respectful Muslims, then that's when their appeal is going to really take a nosedive.
And just, again, being a heavily radical group, they've not had a lot of success governing with that. And I'm not comparing, I'm not saying the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is just like the Islamic State, but and it's illustrative in that they got in power, they really started pushing their version of the way the government should be run and their version of Islam. And a lot of the other folks who, thought it was a great idea at first, not such a good idea now. Same thing with a lot of the Sunni tribes in Iraq in particular, who, they thought this was great because they're really sticking it to old Maliki and they don't like him and they don't trust him, but you live under that for a little while, that really difficult stuff that Jim just mentioned, and you tend to change your mind a little bit, because most of the Sunnis out in that area are not heavily radicalized in that. They're very opportunistic, and they see this as an opportunity to kind of get some power back, but it's an awful bad bargain, and I think you're going to see some kickback to that. But the key is, after you allow those guys to have the power long enough, it gets that much harder to push back against them. And sometimes that what seemed like a good bargain could really, really backfire. So I don't think the Muslim world is going to embrace this necessarily. There's going to be a slice of it who agree with them, but boy, I hope to heck not everybody, because it's not a good deal at all.
All right, well, thank you for coming to the Heritage Foundation today, and if you'll join me in thanking our panel.